Welcome everybody to The Right Dose. It's OPA's live education series. Tonight we're going to be talking about mRNA-1273 COVID-19 vaccines. I know you received an email not too long ago which had the wrong title on it, but we are going to be talking about the Moderna vaccine. It's got some great stuff to talk about today. My name is Ruth Ackerman, and I'm the Director of Professional Development at the Ontario Pharmacists Association. I'm going to be moderating this evening. I want to thank Moderna for assisting us in getting this information out to you tonight. And as always, I think a lot of Canadians want to thank Moderna for the science and the work that they've done. I, for one, am a Moderna. Let me just talk about OPA and provide you a little bit of information, and then I'll introduce my speakers. Don't forget to put in your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom, and we'll answer your questions after the two speakers present their information. So for those of you who may be new, OPA is Canada's largest advocacy organization and professional development provider for pharmacy professionals across Ontario. With over 10,000 members, OPA is committed to enhancing the pharmacy profession and excellence in patient care. The pharmacy profession has played and continues to play a critical role in the vaccine rollout and battle against COVID-19. As of August the 9th, 2021, over 3.3 million COVID-19 vaccine doses have been administered through Ontario pharmacies. This is a significant feat and demonstrates the integral role of pharmacy professionals in the Ontario healthcare system. Let's take a moment to applaud the efforts and the dedication of all pharmacy professionals. So from March 10th, 2021, when this vaccine rollout in pharmacies began, there have been various trials and triumphs, and I'm sure a lot of you can speak to that. And the journey continues as pharmacy professionals work to safely get shots in the arms and move Ontario back to normalcy. At OPA, we are very proud to represent the pharmacy profession. We have advocated for pharmacy to be leveraged in the footprint of the COVID-19 vaccination campaign. One of the major milestones was to have 2,500 pharmacies onboarded to participate in the vaccine program. To date, there are 2,530 pharmacy locations participating across Ontario. We have worked to develop COVID-19 tools and resources like this webinar for pharmacy professionals and have apprised members of news and updates. Without the support of our members, OPA would not be able to continuously advance the pharmacy profession. Our members make what we do possible. Thank you for all pharmacists, pharmacy technicians, assistants, interns, and students who are working on the front lines and have stepped up to protect our communities and Ontarians. So I'm delighted to introduce our first speaker this evening, Dr. Shazad Iqbal. He is the Senior Medical Director at Moderna and comes from an extensive academic and industry-based research and development background with a focus on infectious diseases and vaccine development. He began his career at Sanofi Pasteur as a scientist working on discovery, preclinical studies of vaccine candidates, as well as the development of clinical trials. He then moved to analytical R&D, where he worked on product development and was a project leader for the HIV vaccine portfolio, conducting follow-up clinical trials for the world's first ever successful HIV vaccine candidate. His long-standing interest in the advancement of vaccines and public health spurred his move to GlaxoSmithKline. These are all names you're very familiar with, enabling him to navigate the complexity of bringing vaccines out of R&D and implementing them in the population. There, he led a pediatric portfolio of vaccines and eventually progressed to become the Chief Scientific Advisor for GSK Vaccines in Canada. His end-to-end experience with early days to life cycle management of vaccines, combined with his passion for public health, continues to be a cornerstone in his work to ensure novel vaccines reach the populations they are designed to protect. Take it away, Dr. Shazad.
Thanks, Ruth. And just confirm for me that you're seeing my slide.
I am.
Excellent. Okay. Thank you very much again, Ruth, and to the Ontario Pharmacists Association, really for the opportunity to be here this evening. It really is a great pleasure for me to be able to be part of this session. And I would echo the words that Ruth mentioned earlier during the introduction. A big thank you to all the efforts that are going on and the role that you've had in this, in the rollout of these COVID vaccines here in Canada. Your impact is phenomenal. I'm also especially excited to be part of an event with Dr. Christine Palmé, who I know is a wealth of knowledge on immunization and preventative care and a passionate advocate for vaccination. She's been a trusted source of expertise throughout this pandemic, and I'm looking forward to her presentation, as well as the question and answer period that will follow. I have the fortune of being able to speak with you at a time when the tide really has turned on COVID-19 spread here in Canada. We are in a very unique position compared to many in the world, where we have enough vaccine for everyone who is eligible to receive it. In fact, over 80% of the eligible population has received one dose, and almost 73% now have completed their second dose. However, that means that there's about 20% of people who are eligible for the vaccine and are either still hesitant or outright refuse. This at a time when the Delta variant is starting to take off in Canada and is leading us into a fourth wave of infection, and is especially concerning given that our children are about to head back to school. It really stresses the importance of trying to ensure that we continue our efforts to encourage as many people as we can to get vaccinated and complete their doses per the schedule in order to protect both themselves and, importantly, to protect the population who is currently ineligible for the vaccine. So the session this evening is actually designed to inform you about mRNA vaccines and how to speak about them with confidence to your patients. I will provide a background to mRNA vaccines and also give a little bit of an update on the clinical research programs, as this is a topic that really centers on the manufacturers right now. I'll then turn it to Dr. Palmé, who will discuss the latest in terms of information and really focus on the best practices to address vaccine hesitancy. So I'm going to start with a set of slides on disclosures. All of the COVID-19 vaccines are currently under interim authorization by Health Canada. So please do refer to the product monograph or the Health Canada website for any up-to-date information. As we will be discussing current research and results, I am also pointing out that at the moment, Moderna's COVID-19 vaccine is awaiting its indication for use in the adolescent population between 12 and 17 years of age here in Canada. And also right now, no vaccine is currently indicated for boosting. This is an entirely large set of slides, and I have another one that also says a lot about forward-looking statements. Effectively, all this is saying is that they are disclaimers reflecting the fact that there is a lot of information that is constantly evolving in the current environment. And also, I will disclose that I am an employee, of course, of Moderna and hold shares in the company. So currently, there are 4 authorized vaccine products for use in Canada. These are the COVID-19 vaccine from Moderna, the Pfizer-BioNTech COVID-19 vaccine, the AstraZeneca COVID-19 vaccine, and the Janssen's COVID-19 vaccine. The first 2 are based on an mRNA platform technology, and the latter 2 are based on an adenovirus platform technology. I'm going to, of course, focus on the mRNA technology, as there continues to be a number of questions around this platform, based largely on the fact that, of course, it involves genetic material. And that tends to invoke a little bit of fear. I hope that through this talk, we're going to be able to address some of the myths that have developed out there. And while I will focus on the development of the Moderna vaccine, as well as the future of where Moderna is taking mRNA, the intent is not to compare this to the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine, and rather to address the general principles by which this technology actually works. So let's get started. So by now, many are actually familiar with the basic principles by which mRNA vaccines work. Basically, mRNA is encapsulated into something called a lipid nanoparticle and injected into the muscle. There, it will fuse to the cell and deposit the mRNA into the cell cytoplasm. In the cytoplasm, ribosomes will actually translate the mRNA sequence into a target protein. In fact, many ribosomes can actually attach themselves to the mRNA and translate the sequence into the protein. And after processing in the endoplasmic reticulum, the protein can actually be secreted or embedded into the cell membrane or remain in the cell, depending on where the protein will have its effect. In the case of the spike protein used in the COVID vaccine, it's actually anchored to the cell surface. Now, the main areas where people have been asking questions relates to the fact that it is a genetic material, and could it actually get into my DNA? So here's how I actually explain this to my friends and neighbors. To start with, your cells contain DNA, which make up your genetic code, and has generally been referred to as the blueprint of life. It actually sits within the nucleus of your cells, and it's essentially the blueprints for making your proteins and those key molecules that actually make up your cells, your tissues, and actually your body. So in order for this to work, you need to take those DNA sequences that make up your genes and have them translated into proteins. The process actually works in two stages. The first is called transcription. And this is where you're making corresponding copies of your DNA into something called RNA. And essentially, that's making it into a message. So to come back to that analogy that follows sort of the blueprint image that I referred to, if you have a blueprint to make a building, for example, then think of RNA as the instructions that a foreman gives when reading the blueprints at a construction site. RNA is the instructions that says, go build the stairs over here, or maybe put the elevators over here. And importantly, this is how you should make it. Well, that RNA copy, called messenger RNA, or mRNA for short, actually leaves the nucleus and enters the space into your cells that contains the other machinery. And here's where it's translated, as mentioned before, by those ribosomes, turning those instructions into proteins. So there are really two things that are very important here. The first is that mRNA is inherently unstable. It doesn't actually last very long in your body before it's actually broken down. And then the second thing is, once the mRNA leaves the nucleus, it doesn't go back in. In fact, it's actually chemically different than DNA, so the two don't even really mix together. All this to say, you won't change your DNA. Now, why is this so revolutionary? Well, basically, it's because we've actually found a more efficient way to make vaccines. The traditional way, or the traditional ways, in fact, were actually to make these proteins of interest by growing them up in cells in massive quantities and purifying them in very large manufacturing facilities. Many then had to be mixed with an adjuvant and then put into vaccine vials in large complex processes. Here, what we're doing is we're actually using your body as the manufacturing facility by simply using the same machinery that we normally use to make proteins. And it sounds really crazy, but if you think about it, that's actually what a virus naturally does. A virus is simply an organism that wants to replicate itself, and it gets into your cell and uses the machinery that's there to make copies of itself. The key difference is that we've removed all the parts of the virus instructions and instead focused on just one part, that spike protein, that's immunogenic and will produce or will induce a protective immune response. The other part of this is, of course, the LNP, or the lipid nanoparticle, which is actually made up of 4 different components. The most important of which is the ionizable lipid called SM102, which allows the mRNA to enter inside of the particle. So it completely encapsulates the mRNA. It serves 2 main functions: to keep the product stable and also to fuse to the cell and release the mRNA into the cell cytosol. There are different types of LNPs that have been created. Each actually have different functional properties in the body, so they suit different types of therapeutic needs. And then lastly, how does it work? Well, the vaccine is actually taken up and the spike protein is expressed on antigen presenting cells. It induces both a neutralizing antibody as well as a cellular immune response to the spike antigen. these contribute to the protection against COVID-19 disease. So to date, most of the data has actually been focused on the generation of strong antibody responses, as is assessed by both overall titer of the antibody, or the amount of antibody that you generate, as well as assessing the functionality of the antibody. We do that by using viral neutralization assays. This is important to understand, as when we discuss the new variants of concern, the antibody recognition of those spike proteins in the new antigens is one of the largest concerns. Now, one of the things that we were asked to present on was to give a little insight into really where mRNA technology is going. And this slide describes the different programs that we already have in progress and are organized into what we call modalities. Essentially, they represent different scientific milestones or clinical targets which are actively being researched. There are two core modalities here that I'll highlight. The first is prophylactic vaccines. And those include things like the COVID vaccine, but you'll notice that there are others, such as the flu vaccine, or we actually have an RSV vaccine, which has now been fast-tracked by the FDA, CMV vaccine, which is actually heading into phase 3 trials soon. So there's a number of vaccines that are related to infectious disease, which are ongoing. The second one is actually on systemic or secreted and cell surface therapeutics. So here is basically, and I'm not sure if you're seeing my mouse here, but within systemic intracellular therapies, if you recall, what we were able to do is actually tailor the proteins that are produced to stay within the cell. And so this is actually very instrumental, for example, when we're dealing with certain rare diseases, such as propionic acidosis, for example, which has already started clinical trials. Alternatively, they can be secreted proteins. And I'll just pick on one right here just to highlight, which is a trial that's been done, an established proof of concept here for chikungunya virus. And oftentimes when we talk about viruses, people think, well, we're making another vaccine, but in fact, this one is actually making an antibody. So here what we've done is use mRNA to actually make both the heavy and light chain of an antibody and have that actually secreted. Why that's interesting is if you think about all the biological therapies out there, they're all antibody based, and currently they are all actually made through the regular manufacturing cycle. So again, the opportunity here is what if we can actually have the body make those antibodies ourselves? Other therapeutic modalities exploratory modalities include things such as personalized cancer vaccines or intratumoral immuno-oncology. We even have one for localized regenerative therapeutics, one specifically here, which is aimed actually at targeting and developing a mechanism for growing new vessels in your heart. And then in terms of future modalities and where we're going, we're now currently looking at one specifically for the lung and another in stem cells. So as you can see, the broad takeaway here is that mRNA is taking off in many respects. But bringing it back to the COVID program, in terms of the clinical updates for COVID, I'll focus on the ones that are listed here in orange. Essentially, we currently have completed the preliminary data for the adolescent indication. It's with Health Canada, awaiting approval. And in fact, the data was actually recently published in the New England Journal of Medicine. The second update is for the KidsCo trial. This is specifically for those 6 months through to 11 years of age. That was a 2-part study. Part 2 is actually now in progress. In fact, it started dosing. It's the larger efficacy portion of the trial. It started dosing in the US last week, and we anticipate that enrollment will start here in Canada in the next couple of weeks, and certainly aiming by the end of August. We aim to have that study ready for consideration by the regulators by December. And then lastly, the booster program, of which I'm going to spend a couple of slides on, just explaining the strategies that Moderna are taking to go over or to start to address what we're starting to see emerge here. So Moderna's strategy is actually based off of a couple of things. The first is to closely monitor both the emerging variants as well as the waning immunity. We now know that the mRNA vaccines are actually very highly effective. However, the new variants continue to arise. And so in the face of sort of growing spread of the disease across the globe, as well as with the eventual pressure to change, we anticipate that more variants will probably come along as well. The other aspect is, of course, is to try and understand how long will immunity last in those that have been vaccinated. New data emerging suggests thus far they are well protected against severe outcomes. However, what we do look towards are indicators of vaccine failure. This is either through breakthrough infections or as early indicators, we look to those who are most susceptible, such as the immunocompromised. The second aspect then is then we take these unknowns, and that forms the basis for Moderna's strategy, where the mRNA platform and its potential advantage of being very flexible in terms of what you can create, as well as the speed to make those changes, are able to be leveraged in any strategy that we put forward. So I'm going to briefly describe to you the different strategies that we're taking here right now that are exploratory. Moderna is actually basically pursuing 3 different strategies in order to be prepared for the future. In fact, preliminary data is actually coming out now from clinical studies where we took individuals who were vaccinated in our phase 2 and phase 3 trials and boosted them 6 to 8 months after they completed their primary series. This was done with 3 different formulations. The first is either with the original vaccine, so this is the mRNA-1273 vaccine. It was done, of course, with the current dose, but then also with a different dose, in fact, a half dose volume too. So currently the doses are 100 micrograms of mRNA in our current formulation. We explored looking at a half dose of 50 micrograms as well. The second formulation is actually to take one of those variants of concern. In this case, we actually took the beta, which is the 351 strain, and we again evaluated it in the in both preclinical as well as clinical spaces, looking at that as a single mRNA booster shot. The third one, which is actually a unique capability for us, is where we were actually able to make a multivalent formulation. In this case, one of the formulations that we've explored is called the 211 program, where we've combined both the original strain as well as the 351 strain into one formulation and boosted with that. I think the advantage here is, of course, that we've already achieved proof of concept that we're able to do multiple mRNAs within one formulation. In fact, the CMV vaccine is composed of multiple mRNAs already. So preliminary data is actually coming from these 3 strategies. And what it suggests is that in the immediate future, at least, a booster with a half dose of the original strain will likely be sufficient. However, we are awaiting data from a larger trial to confirm that this approach would be supported. So with that, I'll say thank you. I'm going to stop my my slides, and I'm going to turn it back over to Christine at this point.
Thank you. That's fascinating. There's just so many things change so quickly, and the promise of the technology is just unbelievable. So it's pretty exciting. So Let me introduce, tell you a little bit about Dr. Pomé. Dr. Christine Pomé graduated from the Western University Schulich School of Medicine in 2006, during which time she was granted several awards, including a National Scholarship for Outstanding Candidates Pursuing Family Medicine. She completed her residency at the University of Toronto in 2008 and currently manages a busy family medical practice in Midtown Toronto. Dr. Pomé's passion lies in providing comprehensive medical care with a focus on preventative medicine and women's health. He speaks and writes regularly on topics such as immunization and contraception. He was listed as Now Magazine's Best Doctor in 2013, 2015, 2016, and continues to be a steady presence in Toronto's Best of lists. Dr. Pomé was honored by the Federation Medical Women of Canada with their 2016 National Reproductive Health Award. She continues to be active in the media and speaking circuit for public education and awareness regarding many health issues. Really happy that she could join us, and take it away.
First of all, can everybody hear me?
Yes, I hear you. We can see your slides too.
Wonderful. Then it's a perfect start to hopefully a perfect evening. First and foremost, a big thanks to the OPA. I'd just like to take 2 seconds to acknowledge my pharmacist colleagues. One of my biggest endeavors in the past few months is to highlight the importance of collaboration in medicine. As a primary care physician, functioning in a typical siloed medical sphere, we could not have survived the influenza season and the rollout for the COVID vaccine. So hats off to our pharmacy colleagues. And I really hope that this talk is going to pivot a movement for a vaccine counseling, some tips and tricks, but also to highlight the collaboration needed amongst primary care, whether that's nurse practitioners, pharmacists, or physicians like myself. Messages need to be clear. They need to be consistent. They need to be repeated. And I think going forward, as vaccines are distributed across all locations, primary care offices and pharmacies, we're going to have to develop a strategy that's cohesive to ensure that those shots are getting into people's arms. Now, obviously, this talk is about COVID vaccines in particular, but my vaccine strategies are for vaccine counseling in general. As I mentioned, pharmacies have become common in terms of patients' preferred location to receive vaccines. And from my perspective, it doesn't matter where a patient actually goes as long as they're getting the care they need. So keep calm and carry on vaccinating, vaccine hesitancy, and hopefully you'll leave with some clinical tips. So these are my disclosures. I have the honor of speaking with several pharma companies across all areas of primary care. I am being paid by Moderna for this presentation as well. So the objectives of my portion are more practical. They're to address vaccine hesitancy and complacency, not only with respect to COVID vaccines, but vaccines in general, to summarize an overall systemic approach when counseling patients, and to provide digital resources. Vaccine hesitancy is a tale as old as time. So this is from the early 1800s, a vaccine hesitancy cartoon highlighting the perils of getting a smallpox vaccine. And these characters are having all these adverse side effects from that inoculation. That started the whole vaccine movement. They don't actually show pictures of what cowpox amounted to, but or smallpox did, but you can get the gist that this is new. This is not new. But what is new to us in this age is social media. I think that there's been a few iterations of great shifts in society: the Industrial Revolution, the onset of computers, mobile devices, and Instagram and social media apps, I think mark another huge shift in the way that people access information. There's no point in fighting the movement. It's here to stay. As I tell my medical colleagues who are still entrenched with typewriters, the internet's here. It ain't going anywhere. But how do we navigate through the murky waters of medical advocacy, fighting pseudoscience, and providing credible information to patients? My first clinical trip is language. Don't use the word change. I often add hot off the press segments to my talks because information evolves every day. And I very much encourage you after this webinar to go online and see how much information has evolved today, including some indications for a third dose, some recommendations around school immunization programs. And you can imagine, when coupled with pseudoscience and internet postings, these evolving guidelines confuse patients. I just had a long discussion with a patient today who was hesitant to get her vaccine. And the way I framed it was, don't let the system, don't let the bureaucracy prevent you from having faith in the science. The science is steadfast. It evolves because it is science, and it should evolve as we, in vivo, witness reactions and new information. If it was static, it wouldn't be science. And I think if we frame things carefully, watch our language, and spend time catering discussions to a patient's particular risk factors. The uptake is huge, and we're going to have some evidence-based slide on that. So, complacency in patients often have a low perceived risk of contracting infectious diseases. Now that's changed. About a year and a half ago, I could not have a discussion about NACI and CDC with patients. Now it's Zoom cocktail party chatter. So you can actually harness a newfound interest in preventative care. And I call it riding the COVID wave. The silver lining of this pandemic is patients being aware of statistics and guidelines in a way that's unprecedented. So in some cases it can be frustrating, but I always say flip it and harness it to our advantages. Vaccine preventable disease is not seen as threatening or urgent. We have all this COVID chatter, but what about other vaccines, tetanus, measles, mumps, rubella? And I think it's important, that when a patient's coming in for any vaccine, we don't focus on that particular vaccine exclusively, but we talk about other important vaccines, HPV, disease states that are transmissible and are a public health concern. So, general strategies for optimal patient education, building a sense of trust. As healthcare providers, we really do have a privilege that can't be squandered. I'm going to show some great slides looking at the most significant factor in ensuring that a patient gets a vaccine. And it is by far their primary care provider's recommendation. Increased exposure to information, providing credible information, pamphlets, posters, digital resources. I highly recommend that you download some of the websites, and I will share them with Ruth so she can share them with the audience. Information evolves. I used to send emails every Monday, sort of summarizing the hot off the press topics, only to find that by Monday evening, my email was old news. So instead now I send patients to trustworthy websites that are updated real time. Adopting a systemic approach. So as a pharmacist, when you see a patient, for example, who's coming in, let's say for their COVID vaccine and they have COPD, you're obviously there, to give them their COVID vaccine, perhaps renew their medications. What about other vaccines? Influenza, pneumococcal. So having a clinical scenario where a patient is there, obviously concerned about their health, and celebrating that patient's desire to get a vaccine, but also talking about their personal risk factors relating to other ways to prevent disease. Having documentation set, so with patients getting vaccines in different locations, translating that into whether it's emails or faxes to ensure that all parties who are involved in the patient's care, including their primary care physicians, are informed. And I find that personal stories also help. So, in the case where, for example, a pediatric patient comes in, having a discussion with them, particularly about your child and a scare with a fever, those personal anecdotes really do bring down public health to a single personal level. So as I've mentioned, God bless our pharmacy colleagues for their role in ongoing immunization care. And I think this is going to be, I call it the post-plague normal. Right now we're sort of still in the siloed medicine state, but the old adage of having to go to your family doctor's office that's only open between 9 to 5 to get a vaccine is absolutely ridiculous. So increasing accessibility, education, and access is going to be imperative going forward to create a kinder, more efficient healthcare system that's quite frankly more effective. So challenges posed by COVID-19 in general, obviously safety protocols. We're now entering in what seems to be the 17th wave and possible lockdowns. As a medical facility, we still need to have social distancing, PPE in place. Logistics. So as a family care provider on the 6th floor of a non-medical building, during influenza season, having patients go up in an elevator, being socially distanced, not having an exit and entrance that were difficult, made it impossible for me, to provide the amount of influenza vaccines that I needed to. So I was so thankful to have pharmacies as a second option. And, I truly think there is, again, going to be an increased demand for the influenza vaccine, which is a wonderful, wonderful thing. But how are we going to meet the demand? And collaboration is the way to go. So the number one barrier consistent across all vaccine types, whether it's a COVID vaccine, an HPV vaccine, a pneumococcal vaccine, is lack of physician recommendation. I'm going to repeat this a few times. Every time I present about vaccines, I highlight this. A confident recommendation from a physician or primary care provider is single-handedly the most important factor in a patient's acceptance and uptake of any vaccination. That's huge. That is a gift, and it should be used. Physicians, nurses, pharmacists, and office staff all play a vital role. If my office staff takes a call and says, you know what, your tetanus shot is not that important, it's the pandemic, it can wait, that's not acceptable. We have to provide consistent messages so that a patient is not confused. Right now, everything's evolving, and we have to be steadfast in certain recommendations. When all office staff and allied healthcare professionals ask patients about a vaccination, it helps to reinforce the message. Repetition is key. So being proactive about patient counseling. Now, as we're in a year and a half to a pandemic and a hybrid type of medicine, my virtual calls are jam-packed. If a patient comes in or calls in for a toenail fungus, I'm not just talking about their toenail fungus, I'm reviewing their PAPs, with our other preventative health care. And I'm also taking an opportunity to discuss vaccine in general. So I'm being proactive. I'm not waiting for a patient to ask. Educating the patients on side effects so that in multi-dose series, they don't shy away from a second shot, and so that you don't get those panicked calls. It's all about expectations, particularly with fevers. A fever 2 years ago meant completely something different than it does today. So if a patient receives a vaccine and they develop a fever within 48 hours, it's probably not COVID, it's probably the vaccine. If they develop a fever a year out or 7 days out, it's probably not the vaccine. And being proactive in guiding patients with respect to expectations is consistently shown to increase uptake and ensure that a patient has trust in you going forward. So setting expectations in general, not only talking about side effects, but educate a patient. What is being treated? There is always confusion about the annual influenza vaccine versus the pneumococcal vaccine. What is gastroenteritis? Is it the stomach flu? Being very careful about using language. So flu, I shy away from. I use terms like influenza, virus. Instead of saying the common cold, I say rhinovirus. We need to re-educate the patient population so that there isn't confusion. And once again, side effects and management, particularly of fever. So the importance of preventative care during COVID. Way back in March 2020, most large medical bodies, and we'll go through a few, said immunizations are an essential component of preventative healthcare and should continue. Logistically, that didn't happen. We were scared. Many offices didn't have PPE in place. We didn't have the geographic space for social distancing, and vaccine rates across the board dropped. So the World Health Organization, the Public Health Agency of Canada, and the Pediatric Society said, we are concerned. Heaven forbid an outbreak of a vaccine preventable disease happen during the COVID pandemic. And we've seen clusters of measles, mumps, rubella happen, and with ongoing dips in immunization rates, this continues to be a concern. Even more so, having a call to action on behalf of all primary care providers, including pharmacists, including nurses, including physicians, to remind patients that they cannot delay their vaccines. So in general, just some tips, particularly to COVID, any medical appointment is an opportunity to discuss vaccines. So that COPD patient who comes in, you're talking to them about the COVID vaccine, upcoming influenza season, which is around the corner again, their pneumococcal vaccine, providing credible resources digitally that are updated real time, embracing the opportunity to specifically address a patient's concerns. You'd be surprised No assumptions. Oftentimes physicians assume it's a cost issue. It's very rarely a cost issue, and we'll have a slide boasting to that. Discussing office protocols, how we as primary care providers are ensuring that a patient's safety is forefront and important when planning our in-office visits. Proactively thanking a patient for making preventative healthcare a priority. This plays forward. You'd be shocked if a moment of appreciation, and recognition that a patient has come in for public health, for altruism, for themselves, really does go a long way. And co-administration when possible. There's still some guidelines in Ontario about that. So just very quickly, NACI has yet to officially change this. Some provinces are not adhering to this. BC has their own protocols, but in Ontario, it's still, you cannot get a vaccine 14 days before your COVID vaccine and 28 days after, except for a few exceptions. So if there's post-exposure prophylaxis, if a patient needs a rabies shot, if they need tetanus shot, exceptions are made. As a reminder, this is not evidence-based. This is based on prudence, partially not to confuse side effects. So we're still adhering to co-administration blackout periods. So planning ahead is important and documentation is important. Every visit an opportunity for immunizations again, and just be aware of missed immunizations. So in Ontario, we still have an ongoing closure of school-based programs and catch-up clinics. So for our grade 7 students, the 12 to 14-year-olds, they may have potentially missed their school-based shots. Please, mention this to parents who may not be aware when they come in. I am proactively recalling my 12 to 14-year-olds to see if I have to order those vaccines and provide them in my office. So once again, when asking a patient why they didn't receive a vaccine, the patient's unilateral response across the board is that my primary care doctor didn't talk to me about it. It isn't cost, it isn't convenience, it isn't vaccine hesitancy, it is that they didn't get counseling from their trusted primary care provider. That's huge. So again, logistical impact of COVID-19. We need to continue to make vaccines a priority and harness digital resources. You're seeing patients now in pharmacies for their COVID vaccine. Take that opportunity to say, what about HPV? What about influenza? What about pneumococcal vaccine? It takes 1 to 2 minutes, but the impact is likely without a cost associated to it. So in terms of record keeping, important slide, please print this off and have this at your desk. I have it in every exam room. Patients are receiving vaccines in pharmacies, in convention centers, in family doctors' offices. Somebody has to keep track. And we don't have an online universal portal as of yet, but patients can download for free the Can Immunize app. It's multi-user. So families can keep track of vaccines, parents for themselves, for their children, and it provides a hub. So when a patient comes in, they can flash their phone, they forget their health cards, they don't forget their phones, and provide me information as to when they received their last vaccine, so I can ensure that multi-dose vaccines are kept up to date. In the case of co-administration concerns, you can provide steadfast medicine. So these are some websites for the important pandemic patient. I really highlight the Center for Effective Practice, excellent information about vaccine hesitancy, myocarditis, now third doses, really important. VaxFax, this is hot off the press. 2 days ago, Scarborough Health Unit actually opened up a clinic that's run by doctors, so you can refer your vaccine hesitant patients and they can have a one-to-one discussion about vaccines, particularly COVID, but also other vaccines in general. I think this is brilliant and just launched this week. So in terms of Canadian youth, I'd just like to take a quick moment, particularly because of the new adolescent data emerging. We have concerns about lower vaccine rates in youth and the upcoming school season, potentially university, dormitory living, definitely returning to school, classrooms, behaviors, socialization, and our adolescents starting to travel. So this is data sort of mid-July, and if you look at the 12 to 17 to 18 to 30-year-old rates, we have lower rates of partially and fully vaccinated, and they're kind of plateauing. So how do we address this? This is sort of an age distribution, unsurprisingly, due to the myocarditis concerns that are readily addressed by the CDC as not being as severe as getting COVID, but males are a lot less than females as well. These are websites particularly for your pandemic teen patients. Once again, updated real time, provide information for both parents and youth in particular. I think really we underestimate the roles of adolescents in making healthcare decisions for themselves. So I strongly encourage you to have your adolescent patients, access these websites personally. These are 2 handouts that I personally hand out to my adolescent patients. And it's actually surprising what the uptake is if you take a few moments to provide credible information. And these are some youth COVID hubs. Other general resources, NACI updates, Thrombosis Canada, the COVID vaccine educational models are read in U of T. I highly recommend they're updated real time and provide some great learning online for primary care providers. So hot off the press, the Teen Cove study, Dr. Iqbal, Shazad somewhat alluded to this. So I want to be very clear that we don't have authorization yet for use of the vaccine, of the Moderna vaccine for our adolescents, but this was published in the New England Journal of Medicine towards the end of last week, one of many, many clinical updates. So some exciting possible updates going forward, that we have some great efficacy data for our mRNA-1273 vaccine in our adolescent patient populations based on a study, as I said, New England Journal of Medicine published last week. Gender was split amongst male and females. Age was looking at both 12 to 15 and separated 16 to 17-year-olds. We have younger and older adolescents and the race distribution accordingly. So the most common side effect, very concerning for adolescents, pain at injection site, by far expected, you need to counsel. In general, as would be expected, we also have sort of general flu-like symptoms, which you need to counsel beforehand. So headache, fatigue, myalgias, and chills. No different than the young adult cohort in comparison. No fatalities, minimal serious reactions. So, we have some great data about lack of serious adverse events in our adolescent patients. Particularly important as we trudge through and head towards the school year. We have to get shots in those arms as quickly as possible. So efficacy data, I'm not going to go through everything. We could spend 3 hours talking about this, but they actually very wisely measured efficacy based on 2 definitions of COVID symptoms. One was based on the COVE study, much more vigorous, much more demanding in terms of what they considered to be a COVID case, and the CDC definitions as well. And this is just, I pulled the efficacy rates after 2 doses. They have efficacy rates after 1 dose as well. So I encourage you to look at those. High efficacy rate. This is looking at the rates of COVID based on the stringent COVE study definition. And this is looking at the somewhat less vigorous CDC definition. So we have some great statistics, very promising, and possibly will be updated hopefully before the school year or in the fall. So just a summary, safety data was akin to the adult COVE study, the immunogenicity as well, and efficacy as well. So we have some trending, exciting prospective opportunities to provide vaccine to our young adolescents. So just a little bit of a quip, don't think of it getting as a flu shot, think of it installing virus protection software, reframing things and speaking in terms that patients can understand, catering a discussion to a patient's personal risk factors, all essential when trying to increase vaccine uptake.
Thank you very much, Dr. Pomé. It was, it's sometimes so tough. I like that you talk about getting to where they are and not being judgmental and, throw away what you think and just listen, right? Listening, our ears are probably the most important part of the conversation with our patients on vaccine hesitancy.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And also really, really excited about the news on boosters, and excited about the news on 12 to 17s. The more vaccines we get out there, we can get them in kids' arms before they go back to school, the better off I think we'll all be. So, well, we don't have any questions from the audience. If you have any questions, by all means, put them in the Q&A, and we'll answer them. But yeah, it's been quite a ride for, I'm sure, for Dr. Iqbal on at Moderna. The things changing every day and moving things around, and we're akin to that happening for sure. We have a question. Oh, wants to know about the slides. Will the slides be available?
I'm going to share my vaccine hesitant slides and resources for sure. The data from the tables, if you go to the New England Journal of Medicine, can be readily teased out. So Ruth, I gladly share that, and I'll include some of the pre-templated patient handouts that I often email as well.
Yes, I'd like to send along some of those links that you talked about. Put that in the thank you email that goes out to everyone who's here and people who are not here that couldn't make it but registered. So we'll want to make sure that we have that those links as well. So dosing for children under 12.
Sure, I can take that one. Basically, the trial was actually, as I mentioned, Kids Cove was actually started as a two-part trial. The first part of the trial was an age de-escalation, dose escalation study. And it was done in a smaller subset of individuals. So essentially, there they evaluated 3 different doses, 100 micrograms, which is the current dose at an adult level, and then also 50 micrograms and 20 micrograms. I don't have details as to exactly what they've gone forward with in the larger part 2 study. I think that's details that will come out as the committees themselves make their decisions and then go forward.
Here's one for you, Dr. Pame. How do we address a patient who's hesitant because of unknown risks of fertility?
Excellent question. So, I mean, most of the gynecological bodies, including the SOGC, have had strong statements put forth that they strongly encourage women preconception, pregnancy, and breastfeeding to get the COVID vaccine, right? I have droves of patients that come in and I say, look, everything in life is a risk versus benefit ratio. The risk of you having an adverse outcome if you contract COVID, or heaven forbid, your infant contracts COVID. I had a horrendous case where a woman went in for preterm labor, caught COVID in the hospital and gave it to her infant child, and lived in a multi-generational household where they had to socially isolate 10 people, new mother, 2-year-old at home. What a nightmare. So information, as we said, is evolving. But at present, guidelines would say that primary care encourages all patients, all female patients, whether you're in fertility treatments, whether you're pregnant, whether you're planning to get pregnant, whether you're breastfeeding, to take their COVID vaccine. And that's a strong statement across the board and hasn't changed. If you, I will actually send you my resources. There's some particular resources addressing pregnancy and breastfeeding. The SOGC has a COVID hub that goes through guidance as well. But on a personal level, you know, having a confident recommendation, acknowledging that it's a scary time for a patient, you know, has been remarkable. And most of my pregnant patients have responded. And you know, I don't even, vaccine hesitant in that particular population, I don't know if that's the right term. They're just genuinely concerned because they're childbearing. Right, so there's a whole different component to it. Strongly encourage you though to go to the SOGC and download their resources.
Great, thank you. When do you approximately think we might have approval to inject children under 12? Under 12.
Under 12. So again, I think the aim of getting the Kids Cove data completed, analyzed, and then submitted to the regulators is to have it done for December. So I think that's at that point, when we hand it over to the regulators, then it takes them time to go through all of it. So that's the timelines that we're aiming towards, and I think I'm hoping that we'll get to even see some preliminary data before that even happens. So we'll see.
Excellent. What is the toxicity dose of mRNA vaccines? I guess we're thinking of how many vaccines can you get?
Oh, yeah, interesting. I think it's a challenging question to answer because it's not really about the mRNA, it's what's the mRNA actually making. So it really depends on, what vaccine are you talking about, what's the protein that you're trying to generate, so on and so forth. So I think that's a difficult question to answer, per se.
It's definitely a, coming back to the pharmacology and LD50s and max doses and that sort of thing.
Yeah. One thing that I could probably just expand on a little bit is one of the programs that has been done is actually to infuse this at a high dose in individuals in another disease state, where they've actually done this, like I said, as an infusion, an IV infusion, high doses that were given and then monitored over time. So this is one of those things where you actually were able to measure a dose response curve within there. So relative to what a vaccine gets, I think is actually quite small.
Mm-hmm. There's a question here about the N equals 20 times 3 different arms of the vaccinations that you're currently testing. Where is this trial? How many weeks? Do you have any preliminary findings? It was kind of like one of the last things you talked about before you had.
Yeah. So let me explain it a little bit more in detail here. If you recall, the phase 2 and phase 3 trials were all run in the US. And so what they did is they did something called the P201, sorry, I'm saying this wrong. It's called the P201 study. It was designed purely as a research study where they took 20 people from the phase 2 trial. They took 20 people from the phase 3 trial in one arm and 20 people from another arm. And that's where they actually did a boost in those individuals. So again, those people had gone through their primary series. It had been 6 to 8 months, and then they immunized with them. Some preliminary data actually is available. In fact, believe it or not, one of the best places to actually take a look at what's coming out is on the Moderna Canada website, or the Moderna website for the investors. Those investors presentations are actually oftentimes really good because they have some of the most recent data that comes out. And there's another set of slides, again, all publicly available, where they do research days. And those slide decks, which are actually, I admit, are actually quite intense. There's sometimes 200 slides, but they actually have a really phenomenal amount of data that comes in there. In terms of what does the actual data look like? Well, in effect, what it looks like is we've tested it at 50 microgram doses according to those 3 strategies. One was, again, just boosting with the original vaccine, but at a half dose, 50 micrograms. The other was with a variant of concern. This one was the 351. And then the third one was with the multivalent strategy. That was combining the 351 together with the 1273 original strain. The data basically looks at 2 things. It looks at the ability to boost the immune response. All of them boost the immune response. The thing that's, and in fact, many of those things actually boosted it above the original peak titer, which was achieved 1 month after the primary series. The ones that looked the best was the one where you actually did it with the original strain. And then the second one that looked the best was with the multivalent strain. It's difficult, you can't make comparisons between the arms. It was designed as a research study. There are only 20 subjects per patient, and they were taken from different parts of different clinical trials. So it's not a full clinical study where you're going to make comparisons between those 2 groups. One of the interesting things that did come out from the multivalent was that it was very effective against generating immune responses against a panel of variants of concerns. But interestingly, so was the original one, where you had just done 50 micrograms with the original strain. So where we're leaning towards right now, especially with the current variants of concern that are sort of circulating, is basically we're leaning towards going ahead with a full-on clinical program called the P205 trial. And that would explore multiple arms with larger numbers of people, and then probably looking at, it's probably going to be, the first one that's going to come out is probably the 50 microgram, with the single valent or original strain that was boosted. But I will say that changes all the time because it's all based on data. So that may change tomorrow. We'll see.
Got some really, really good questions here. So does the mRNA vaccine just get into antigen presenting cells, or does it get into other cells of the body, heart, kidney, liver? Be nice to have a quick answer to that.
Yeah, a quick answer is, look, mRNA is actually very unstable. So outside of the cells, in fact, it only lasts, its half-life is about 8 to 10 hours. So it breaks down quite a bit. And the LNPs themselves actually break down quite easily too. So I know this comes up, especially in the conspiracy theory section, is, does it cross the blood-brain barrier and get into the brain? No, there's no evidence that it actually crosses the blood-brain barrier. And they've done studies to show that it really doesn't get into the brain or into some of the other tissues. The vast majority of it really does traffic to stay within the site. It's taken up and then it traffics into the lymph nodes, and that's where it's processed, and then it's gone.
And just as a quick resource, if you go to the Center for Effective Practice, and Ruth, I just sent you a copy of the slides.
Okay.
Patient handouts where they actually addressed, there's a myth busting one, and they'll actually go through and lay out, common misconceptions with very, very clear answers and accompanying resources. So once again, when you have a patient, you expect the questions and provide them in advance the answers.
Can you give us the percentage of myocarditis, pericarditis events in Canada?
In Canada, I'll take a crack at this, and maybe Christine, you might be able to add something in here, but the latest data that I really saw was from the ACIP presentation on June 23rd. I know that this is one of those adverse events that is actually reported and tracked weekly as well in Canada. So you can always go to the Public Health Agency of Canada's adverse event weekly reporting site, which will have updated numbers. It's difficult for me to give you an actual percentage just because that data hasn't been standardized against the Brighton collaboration definition of myocarditis, to my knowledge. What I will say is the number that I remember from the ACIP presentation, which is in the US, was 12.3 cases per 1 million doses, I believe, of the second dose of the vaccine. So it's very rare.
And like anything else, you just stratify the data, based on age and sex and counsel appropriately. So vast statistics like that, I find when counseling patients aren't particularly helpful. But referring them to a website where they can actually look at risk and putting it in context. So the risk of myocarditis or pericarditis post-COVID or post-virus, quite high. And it sort of reframes things. And we were talking a bit about this before, is that not only do you have to provide credible information, you have to provide context. So what is the risk of having the vaccine? What is the risk of not having the vaccine with these particular conditions too?
Exactly. And I'm assuming someone asked about, would kids get the same 2 doses schedule like adults?
That's what's currently being explored in the trial. So yes, right now it's designed as a 2-dose series.
And anything in particular, any rare side effects that we are seeing in the kids? Everyone's always worried because they're kids. It's hard to do trials in children.
Yeah, so in terms of the teen data, nothing unexpected came out. It all matched exactly what we saw in the adults. And the kids, of course, are just getting started at this point, so there's no data to refer to.
Yeah. Let's see. What is the mechanism of the myocarditis caused by the mRNA vaccines?
We don't.
Nobody knows.
Nobody knows, yes.
Nobody knows. There's a lot of speculation and different answers, but there's no known mechanism.
And then for adults 65 plus, if the immunity wanes after 6 months, why not just give a booster?
Great question. Hot off the press, if you go to the guidelines for a third shot, age is not one of the risk factors. They're very, very clear on the immunocompromised definition. There's some disease states and medications. I mean, obviously that's going to expand. So the logical answer is, okay, we don't have the data, nor do we have the indication yet. So TBA.
Yeah. Can I also just take the opportunity to clarify wording that's being used right now? It's very important. ACIP actually used the word third dose, not boosting, right, for the immunocompromised, and that's very specific wording. There is a difference between having to add a third dose for somebody who's immunocompromised, because effectively what we're saying is they weren't able to reach full levels of immunity based off of the primary series of the 2 doses.
Yes.
Boosting is different. Boosting is saying after the primary series, you've gotten the full level of immunity, but that immunity is waning, and therefore I'm going to give you another shot. So there is a difference in definition that's happening right now, and it's very clearly that it is about having a third dose for those immunocompromised individuals.
That's actually extremely helpful, because I think, well, we use a lot of words that passports and all sorts of words that, you know, mean different things, but that's true. So I don't think there is one question about counseling patients on infertility, but I think that I think the important message here is there's a lot of, you know, go to that Center for Effective Practice and find out all these myths that are floating around, and how to deal with them. That Center for Effective Practice seems to be the one that might be the best reference for that.